So hello and welcome to our webinar, Connecting with Your Community Through Collections. I'm Joy Tahan-Rudel, Director of Museums and Collections at CatalogIt, here with our three esteemed panelists. First is Barbara Henry, Principal of Barbara Henry & Associates. Barbara is devoted to transforming museums into cultural partners embraced by their communities. Next, we have Kathleen McLean, Principal of Independent Collections, a museum consultant who often focuses on social issues, public participation, and public response. And finally, Evelyn Orantes, Principal of Evelyn Orantes Consulting, who has dedicated her career to creating experiences that connect people and celebrate the uniqueness of communities. Before we get started, I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping details. First, we are conducting this program in a webinar format, and in the interest of time, all the attendees will remain muted and will not be using the chat or question features. You are welcome to email me after this program if you have any additional questions. You can reach me at joy@catalogit.app, and I'll be happy to forward any questions you have to the panelists, and we'll get answers back to you. When you registered, we asked for questions, and due to the number of questions submitted, we have compiled the most frequently asked questions and will include as many as we can in this discussion. If you do not hear your question answered, we will be working to send you personal emails with answers to your questions later this week. Many thanks to everyone who submitted a question. We were really inspired by them. Last, we are recording this webinar and will make the recording available on our site in about a week. We'll send out an email with information on accessing the recording soon. Now let's begin the program. I'm excited to be here today with three women who have really inspired me during my career. I have been a museum registrar and collection specialist for 30 years, the first 25 working in a museum setting. During my museum years, I struggled with the conflict between collections care and access, preservation of the object, and connecting the story of that object with the community. Over the years, these three panelists pushed me out of my comfort zone and helped me understand how important it is to share our collections with our communities, and how this sharing is what brings our communities together and preserves their stories. I hope that listening to their stories will help inspire you too. Now I'd like each panelist to introduce themselves and take a moment to talk a little bit about their experience. Barbara, why don't you start?
Okay, so I'm Barbara Henry, and my experience, a lot of it was with the Oakland Museum of California, where I served as Chief Curator of Education and then became Lab Director. But I would like to say, I think during about 30+ years of doing that, doing the community engagement work was transformative for me personally and professionally, and has stayed with me to a really endured passion that when we work with communities, it really, to make it effective, it has to transform internally as well. And I think really bridge the different perspectives and passions we all have. So I wasn't trained for it. It's just knocked down, just hands-on, scrappy work that you learn on the job. So hopefully, we'll discuss that more later. So.
Thanks, Barbara. Kathy, would you like to go next?
Thank you for having me and inviting me to this. This is a really exciting topic. And I think I've been working in museums for, let's just say, over 40 years, as you can tell. And so I've had a lot of experience, but all of my experience has been focused on community engagement. Really, before community engagement was a term that people used, but it really was about, the words have changed over the years: audience engagement, visitor friendly practices, lots and lots of terms and conversations about our relationship with the people who come to our museums. And I think today we can really focus on some kind of powerful lessons that we've all learned that you can now apply in this unusual new time, which I think for most of you out there, while it seems like it's a scary time, it's also a time potentially for great opportunity. And so I'm hoping that we can focus on the opportunities ahead of us.
I guess that leaves me. Evelyn Orantes, and I too have been around a couple of around the block a couple times. My first job right out of college was with Barbara as my boss, and I feel like these two, I mean, everybody, in this panel has really inspired and has really helped me kind of ground my work. One of my favorite stories to share was how I too am like your community members and needed to be converted into thinking of museums as a place for me. I used to live a block and a half away from the Oakland Museum of California and passed by its concrete walls every day for like, I don't even know. I used to catch the metro to go to college, which is right across the street from the Oakland Museum. Never set foot into that museum. And it wasn't until there was a big community celebration that I went, but I didn't go because I was there to see like, oh, this is gonna be so great. It was more like they're co-opting my culture and we're gonna have impromptu picket signs and we're gonna cause a fuss. And but when I showed up, I was like, oh, wait, there's other community members that look like me here. And not only are they participating, they helped plan this. And so I instantly wanted to be part of it. And then 20 years later, I'm still part of museums. So I, like many of your community members, needed to be converted and convinced that museums were a place for me.
Thank you, Evelyn. So we're going to move on to some questions. Our goal is for this to be conversational between Barbara, Evelyn, and Kathy. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and they're going to use that as a jumping off point for conversations. So let's start with the first one. What are some of the ways that communities can make connections with each other and with the museum through virtual programming and exhibitions with existing collections assets? So Barbara, do you want to start, like kick off, and then we'll have the conversation from there?
Yeah, and I'm going to take the idea of looking at virtual programming in particular in exhibitions. But for me, I don't know, I have to look at this in the context of where we are at this moment in time, in our communities, in our nation, in the world. And that's how I've always approached this work. And I see right now, I see this sense of lack of trust. I see so much misinformation, a lot of divisiveness that's happening. And I think what's so important museums can do is to help build back trust, build back journalism, help to decipher what's fact, what's fiction, the myths, etc., to kind of help rebuild us in our social fabric. And so with that, and I also see the context with COVID and everything happening now, I view this as a bubble of a tremendous laboratory work right now. We're all experimenting. Think about when we went to shelter in place, like right away, all this stuff started happening with museums doing all kinds of things, how they were doing virtual programming. And I think it's going to go through different stages. But what I'm struck by, you guys, what you think is when I looked at the range, I did a little bit of more research just recently. With some institutions, what they're doing is taking, let's say with the protest movements that have been happening in the summer, really going into their collections that demonstrate where there were protests other times in history. Because the idea is the point of help to create the sense of resilience and not hopelessness for all of us, and how their objects help to instill the sense of reality, history, fact versus fiction, and that we are part of a continuum in history. And to see those collections helps us in that context, helps us to see that. So I see that happening, being posted on Facebook. You see I know someone who's done at the Baltimore Museum of Industry, they got together with a local organization that does neighborhood walking tours as a collaboration, and they inserted aspects of their collections into the tours in terms of the mobile app, another way of thinking about their collections and bringing reality and truth to how their neighborhoods evolved. And so many museums are doing virtual tours. What I see, like the National Civil Rights Museums, if you go to their website, they're linking you to all these amazing partners, which they call as trusted partners. And you see that happening then. Who are their partners? What are they dealing with? So I'm really happy when I see that going on. The same thing with the Tenement Museum. They're dealing with the issues of social justice, immigration, that helps us give a context of how we deal with our struggles today. I mean, that's just sort of a handful, and not to mention the idea of, are we going crazy sheltering in place? What can we do at home? So we do at home, but we want to get off our devices. So you look at some museums, they're saying, okay, this is what you can do, at home here. We're going to show you how to draw, how to look at nature, now go off and do it, some demonstrations. I see a lot of creativity happening now, and to me, it's all about building the sense of resilience and hopefulness, and also bridging together, learning from each other as they're bringing in partners into their dialogues. I mean, that's just at the top of the icing for me a little bit. There's a lot more, but those are some of the things that I'm excited to see happening now as we're experimenting. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think the notion of working together, and we've all been feeling isolated, but in fact, if we think of ourselves as partners and community members along with everyone else, we can do a lot with what we have right now. And I think we were talking about this the other day, that the small museums are really positioned to be able to you have a lot of access to the community, and it's much easier for many small museums to do something quickly and just say, well, okay, I could do that, and then tomorrow we could try that. And so I think the notion of sitting down and just thinking about your community, who they are, the diverse members of your community, and they're like concentric circles. They're your best friends and family, and then they're your neighbors, and then there's the person down the street that you see every day, but you don't really know her name. And then there are the people in organizations that you're part of, and there are people who work in your grocery store. And those, when you think about that as your community, it gives me a sense that, oh, okay, we can work together. Because during this time, I've noticed that so many people are reaching out to their communities and helping each other and supporting each other in really unusual and wonderful creative ways. And so this is a time where we could say, and I think one of the first exercises to do is to say, so who is my community? Who do I think my community is? Not the capital C community that we articulate in museums, but or in mission statements and things. But who really are the people in our community, and how might we reach out to them now? And obviously it's going to be digitally or at least 6 feet away, but to start there.
Yeah, I think for me, something you said earlier in your introduction, Kathy, really resonated, and I think we've had other conversations about this, and that's that in this unique time, we actually have a lot of great opportunities to collaborate also with other museums. So that small museum actually can join forces with other museums and become a bigger museum, share collections virtually, and kind of be broader and not feel so isolated, because as professionals, we might be feeling isolated. I also feel like I'm still experimenting. One of the things that, a project that I've been working on is with a local organization that's not even a museum. It's called the Unity Council, and they're a community development museum. And they put on one of the largest Day of the Dead festivals here in Oakland, California. And they had to go instantly virtual. And it's been lovely to work with somebody that can pivot in the way you were describing. Like within, 5 months, we were able to have this dream, pie in the sky session, and dream about all the different ways that we can work with community and serve community. We came up with a marketplace where vendors can showcase their wares for free because they partner with Square. They came up with a video series, DIY video series. So I feel like there's all these amazing, exciting opportunities that I think what's important is not to fixate on trying to translate physical activities into digital activities, because I'm thinking community groups, like when we gather with community groups and ask them for their opinions. Now, instead of maybe doing a focus group or kind of a community gathering, you could go Zoom, but I don't know. I don't feel like it's always dynamic. Or you can do more one-on-ones. Like, you can do more one-on-one conversations on the phone. I'm all about the phone these days because I get tired of being on Zoom all day. But I just feel like we need to rethink the place we're at. And I feel like going back to basics, it's actually been really good. It's been really good to reconnect with folks and really go through the whole ritual of talking to them on the phone, not just texting and kind of presenting yourself in Zoom, because it's a different thing, right? And so I do feel like, what does, going back to the basics mean to you? What are some, ways that you connect with anybody? Honestly, it's like connecting with communities, like connecting with friends, connecting with family. What do you do to stay in touch with them? And so I think just looking at it from that lens could kind of open up some new possibilities.
I think
It
too,
reminds me of, I'm sorry, Barbara, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, it reminds me of one of the questions that came through on the webinar registration was, what kinds of things have you done that haven't worked? And what I find interesting about what you're all talking about is about experimentation and trying things. And something that I know that I learned from Barbara was, try it. It's okay if you fail. And I feel like this is a really good time for experimentation and trying all sorts of things. And if it doesn't work, by somebody's definition of it working, you've learned from it and you can move ahead. Do you feel like this is this time right now is a good time for experimentation? And have you had anything that hasn't quite worked with all of the things you're talking about?
I would say that I've been totally surprised by how successful some of the programs that I've been doing with some of my museum clients have been, having been forced into a digital situation. We were planning and doing things in the physical museum with each other, and we had planned out, I have a couple of contracts where it was planned out where I was going to travel to the museum, we're going to do everything inside the museum with visitors, and we were going to be prototyping. And when that couldn't happen, we just said, well, maybe let's try prototyping online. And we thought, oh, that could be really problematic. And guess what? What I'm finding is that it's easier sometimes to do some of the prototyping online because we're all in the same boat. We're all kind of in our houses. And so we don't have to spend so much time that we do spend it often in museums preparing and getting it perfect and being presentable. And, and then, you have to contact the registrars and you have to get the objects that you're going to be using in a program, and that may take 3 weeks, and there may be a vitrine has to be made for them. Now what you can do is you just say, hi, well, let's do a little program around this object, and you can zoom in on it, and other people, you could ask other people to bring an object, and you could have I think you could have a whole series of programs around what does it mean to have collections, particularly when people are sitting in their homes. And so many people have said to me, I don't spend enough time at home, and I don't pay attention to everything around me because I'm so busy. And now that I'm here, I notice these wonderful things that are sitting around my home. Or I remember this thing that my grandmother gave me that, I just haven't looked at in years, but you could get your community members to all come online and talk about a particular thing in their home that they see with new eyes now that they've been there and not been so busy and rushing out to work every day. All kinds of things that you could do digitally that would allow you to practice so that when you get back into the museum, it's a much better, you've got some skills and you know what people are really liking and what people are really gravitating towards and interested in.
Great. Yeah, I mean, in going back to thinking about the failing, I actually think when you fail, it's a different concept these days and how we identify failing. Real failure is when you do not learn anything from the experience at all. Because in experimenting, you see what worked, what didn't work, and you take it, you scale it. Let's talk about that idea of scaling it up, And also, when you're doing communication work, a big part of this is your relationship building and your bridging. That's what's so important. And sometimes the failures that happen together are those points, depending on how you stay together, of real growth in trust. And the more trust you have with each other, the stronger and bigger your project can become over time. And that does take time. And so I think Cassie Chin from the Wingluck Museum, I heard her say in a program recently, something about being the crises or opportunity, something to that effect. And I feel the same way. When you find these barriers like, oh, in the museum, we can't do that. I wouldn't even say that anymore. It's looking, well, how can we do that? And that's why I think in this work, I think one of the biggest skills for me that's been important is improvisation, which is, it's not yes, but, which is what we'll say. We can't do that in a museum, right? You know, we have to, it's yes, and part of that can be the negotiation. So it's that part of improv, but also improvisation. It also is you're building off your teammates. You know, you're riffing off each other and you're incorporating each other's perspectives to make something work together that can then be so powerful, you know, in whether it's an exhibition, a program, a publication, but it's a different mindset and skill making. And I think for a long time, museums have been resistant to this. And I'm hoping that now we have this kind of reset happening with where we are, that maybe coming out of this, that will be adjusted more.
Yeah, I can't imagine doing any work with collaborators or community, you know, and collaborators, I mean, community are different types of collaborators, without having that muscle, having a little muscle around pivoting, improvisation, experimentation, because a lot of times that's what you're having to do in the moment. You have to pivot and be like, oh, wow, we got that totally wrong. And that's another one that's really important. And I think part of that perfectionism in museums is, it's fear, right? That perfectionism breeds fear of getting things wrong. And the thing is, we are going to get things wrong. And I think if we don't have the humility of being able to say, ooh, I messed up, or, you know, in a way that's responsible, in a way that's thoughtful, I don't know how we're going to go beyond what we're at now. You know, it's like we have to. It's one of those things. I don't know that it's a choice anymore. I don't know if for me, I don't think it was ever a choice. I feel like we've always had to do this, but now it feels like Barbara was saying, there's a little bit more of an openness to it. And given that we have to experiment right now, it's like we're building that muscle. You're going to go in with new muscles back to the museum.
And I think if there are people in the organizations, from my experience, who are resistant to it, let's say leadership or board members or volunteers, they feel threatened, whatever, those have to develop the skill of telling them the benefits of this. And I found the personal stories that I would hear from the public or from our partners of how what we did together impacted them, affected them, always collecting those stories and sharing those with the people who were the doubters was very helpful in helping to bring people along. And that's why that internal transformation, everyone kind of transforms. Where's their pivotal moment when they really transform and get on board with this? If it is beneficial, because they can see the impact it can have. I don't know.
Exactly. And Kathy, you talked a little bit about how your community members can you can do programs where your community members are appreciating and looking at things in their own homes to tell stories. How can museums use their collections to tell stories with their communities? And how can that go back and forth? The community story from their own objects, learning, so the museum learning from the community and the community learning from the museum?
It's a really, really good question. And I think we have to do several things. We have the responsibility as museum professionals to focus on a few things that we need to change and that we need to expand in a way. And that is, for years we've thought about museums and our visitors as audience, and you know, there's been a lot of conversation about that over the years. And so that audience model has kind of put us in a mode where we feel like we have to go off and do all the work, create the setting, the scene, practice our lines, get everything perfect. Then up goes the curtain and the audience is here and we deliver something that's spectacular. And they all go, wow, that was so wonderful. And that's an old paradigm. It's not a totally bad paradigm. I think it's good in some situations, but those situations I think are getting fewer and farther between. And I think the need for different kinds of situations are becoming, the need is more urgent now. So I think the notion of thinking of visitors or the people who are going to be participants because they come and experience your whether they come online or come to your museum, that they're participants and partners, and that we all have stories to tell. Mm-hmm. Human beings are essentially storytelling, story making, story creating animals, and we all have stories to tell. So the notion is not that we tell visitors stories about our objects necessarily, but that we come together as a community and we all tell stories about these different objects. And I have some examples that I think are really quite powerful. That I was in Colombia a year and a half ago. When I was in Colombia, I went to a museum, the Antioquia Museum in Medellin, and they were a classical history, kind of art history museum. Very staid, very formal, very beautiful old building. And there was we'll get back to this question, but one of you in the audience one of you on one of our participants had raised the question of what do you do with your community when your community has changed around you? And that was the perfect instance in Antioquia, because it used to be right at this town square, and it was like the elegant town square, and over 100 years had turned into the kind of really cheesy side of town. So here's this kind of formal, beautiful museum in a town square that had a lot of crime, it had a lot of homelessness, it had prostitutes. And what they did was they just turned everything inside out, and they went out into the town square, into this particular community, and started actually talking to people. And at the end, over a 2-year program, they had people who had homeless people and some of the prostitutes that had worked around the area who came in, who were trained, who really got close to the objects and created exhibitions where they selected objects from the collection and then talked about why that object had such powerful meaning to them. So it wasn't that the curator was telling a story. This was somebody in the community who was telling a story about an object from the museum and why that object really influenced them in some way or really had an impact on them. And we can do that. We can start doing that right now with we don't have to plan this for years. We could start, all kinds of programs to get people to come in and tell stories about the objects in your collection.
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead, Evelyn.
No, I was going to say, one of the things that really speaks to me, and I think you touched upon it, gosh, I'm blanking out. Sorry, Kathy. I was so deep in thought. Is this idea of being in service to community, which we were always wanting to be, and being in community. So in service to community is great. Again, there's pros to doing that. We have something to share, we want to share it. But by being in community, by having those conversations, by going to other events beyond your own, by getting to know the people around you, you're being in community and you're building those relationships and that trust simply by being there. And I think that's where you start uncovering some of these things that you're like, wait a minute, I start connecting the dots, because we assume that because we love our stuff in museums, everybody's gonna love our stuff. And honestly, some people don't care about our stuff. Mm-hmm. And maybe there is one thing that they like in our things, but how do we know what that thing is unless we allow them to kind of guide us and give us some information around that? And I feel like, again, just like this guiding principle of being in community as a way of being in service to community as well. But Barbara, you were going to say something.
Yeah, a couple of things that makes me think of with these objects, the way sometimes we present objects before, didn't always tell all the stories. They told, maybe it was focused on one perspective, or if it was a curatorial perspective, representing different ideas. But when you bring in other voices, it's sort of like, 10 ways to look at this one object. Where are the 10 voices of this object? And I think that allows great opportunities and ways to engage with the public and bringing them in, like Kathy, just what you were saying, your example. We've talked about that for a while now. And it's a simple thing to do that, again, you can scale up. But it reminds me of an exercise we did at the Oakland Museum when Kathy came on board with us to redo the art gallery. We decided as a team in education, remember, we all went off and had teams that went to a different neighborhood in San Francisco and Oakland, particularly Oakland. And each team was to spend an afternoon there, talking with people, looking at the aesthetics. What are the aesthetics like in that? And where are people hanging out? What's the behaviors like? What's going on there? And then we all came back together and debriefed about what was our learnings from this, because we need to engage more with a diverse range of communities. And that was like, I think, one of our steps to start to kind of get more familiar with, but then dig deeper. And I remember there was one group, I don't know if it was a group you were with, Evelyn, and they were talking to staff talked to some teenagers at the Ferry Building of at Metreon in San Francisco. And the teenagers, when they were asked why they came there and hang out there, the teenagers said, because this is where we can feel safe. Finding out why people hang out. You want us to be that third place or that first place. What is it that draws you there? And so that was a helpful, I think, exercise for us to start to look at how we can break down the barriers for that in our institutions.
And I have a suggestion that kind of builds on that, and that is, again, kind of building on what we've said and getting more specific as we talk. I think it would be great to, there are all kinds of different ways to kind of implement this kind of thing, but tell yourself you're going to experiment. This is an experiment. Pull something out of the collection, or maybe 3 things out of your collection. And if you're not there, or if you're still working from home, photographs are just fine. And then pull together a group of people, like 5 people. Maybe one person from the museum, somebody from your church group, somebody from the grocery store, a neighbor, and get everybody on Zoom at the same time. And then show this object and have everyone just look at it or send them the picture ahead of time, and then have everyone practice telling a story about that object. And what you'll find is that it takes practice, and it also takes practice to tell a story, but it also takes practice to actively listen and to actually hear what somebody else is saying about the object. And even if the story might not be accurate in terms of the provenance or in terms of the true significance as far as the museum goes for these objects, what those kinds of exercises do is help you see that sometimes the most humble little stories can have a huge impact on people, and that it's not all about how valuable or expensive or important something is in order to elicit stories. And in hearing other people tell simple stories, I think it's remarkable how that can actually help you think about storytelling in new ways, because it really comes down to who are the storytellers and who's listening, who's talking and who's listening, because all of these transactions in museums are really different kinds of conversations. So if you look at it as a conversation rather than a theatrical presentation where everything is either a major success or a failure and nothing in between, that's just not useful in today's world. But doing like little antique roadshow kinds of things, why do you think so many people watch Antique Roadshow? It's not because their thing is valuable, because these are things that they don't even know these people, but there's something about the stories that people tell about how they got the object, or what it's meant to them, or how long it's been in their family, that has a resonance that is really deep, and it taps into something that museums are really important for, which is kind of connecting people through story.
Well, and I think at the heart of all of this is moving away from that single narrative. You were talking about, having us think about our work and the way that we share objects as, a conversation. And if I'm the authority doing all the talking all the time, it's flat, it's boring. It's not what people, yeah, it's boring. I'm sorry. I don't know how to say that nice. Our world has texture, our world has color, our world has different voices. And if we want to be part of our world, and we are part of our world, it's like, then why don't we act in the same way? It's one of those things that to me, it baffles me. And I think why I get so kind of pumped up about this kind of work, because it's like, I want to convert more people. I know how cool museums can be, but you guys are making it hard sometimes. Just move away from the single narrative, have it be about sharing and these universal things, and I feel like one of my favorite shows that we used to do at the Oakland Museum was Kids Collect. And it was a tiny show.
That was a great program.
It was so precious. It was, teaching kindergartners and middle school kids and high school kids about, the power of objects, and they got to pick the objects. And it's like having them talk about their rites of passage, like, having their bankies or having their first tooth or, these things. But like, what was beautiful about it is that we all connect. All those little kindergartners all lost our first tooth, at some point. All of them had a safety kind of need for a toy or something. And I think that's what brings us together. Like, we're talking about how divisive everything around us is. Museums are a place not only where community can gather, but where we can help make community. And finding those things that unite us instead of divide us is such a powerful way for us to look at our work.
Yeah, and I think it's become, the idea is the professional is personal now. In our culture in particular, and particularly in museums, it's the professional academia, and a lot of people can feel very intimidated. I know, have been by museums, and they feel like I don't have that kind of education, or I wasn't invited. I was waiting to have an invitation. We're thinking the invitation is our marketing stuff, but it's an invitation. I had a community member say that I'd like to come to the museum, but no one has the museum has not invited me. And I had to find out, what does that mean? And it is that bridging that happens. And so we were talking about earlier, I think, Kathleen and Evelyn, that's going out into the community, whether it's changing or not, is looking in your staff, almost like, what's the whole ecosystem of your staff in terms of what are the networks they have out into the community? Because it's those personal connections that can start to create that bridge with the community. I mean, I think with, some people, it's the church they went to. And we would go to them and say, is there someone from the church that we could work with? I mean, it's looking that we're a networking institution, but that needs to go way beyond just the professional work we do, but also in our lives. And how does that connect into the community itself to make us accessible and break down? We used to have this expression, take the institution out of the institution, that perception, the walls, because at the end of the day, it is those personal connections, it is those stories that helps to bind people and bond people together. There's one example I love, and just looking at what's going on here now in our country or in the world with having to reboot and improvise and try new things, I kind of look at other models. And there's one model I saw that came up, and I've seen how we could do this with museums. And you can Google this. It's a newspaper by and for kids. It's called 6 Feet of Separation. It's from a very creative community in San Francisco. And it was started by a father who's a writer, and he was trying to talk to his kids about, well, how are you doing with shelter in place? It was at the beginning of all that. And the kids, were not responsive. And he realized, well, I want to find out, get some support for them. So he had this idea where he created this paper, or the idea of it, but the kids are doing it. And it's a newspaper for and by kids. And kids meaning, I think, 9 or 8-year-olds all the way up through teenagers. And they're all reporters. And they're all sharing what they are doing and experiencing. They're asking each other for advice. Maybe some are showing recipes. Some are showing what they did for a birthday party. But how they're coping, it became a tool for them to cope with each other and not with the adults. And it's gotten so popular, I think now it's gotten national support to go nationwide, but now they also have people from all over the world, kids from all over the world contributing, like drawings and all kinds of stuff. And they call them foreign correspondents. And I look at that as a model, because I really see that museums could do something with that idea, or even if they tapped into them to, bring in objects, via the photographs that Kathy, you were talking about, but look at where's that spark, where's there something happening. And so I really recommend Googling that. It's, again, 6 feet of separation, and it gives me joy every time when I read through all these different perspectives from the kids. I mean, they run with it.
I love that, because it also brings up the idea of who your community is. Because before COVID, your community was your area around you, but now your community can be anywhere. You're touching everyone on the internet. Your community can be as huge or as small. And those kids during the newspaper, they're reaching out to the global community. And so now even the smallest museums are part of a global community. So thinking about, your museum might be in a place where the community is changing around them, but they're also where their community is expanding. Can any of you talk about a little bit about that, about how you reach this global community, and also how you still retain your local community while reaching out to your global community?
Well,
did I stump the panel?
Well, no, I guess I think of it's not something I've recently, but I know I went through a period. We're all in California, and so I mean, the panelists were the four of us, and California, well, the country, of course. Why am I saying California? The country is made up of immigrants, and if you look at those threads, immigrants, we all have our networks that can go out into other regions. And I think particularly if the newer immigrants, or just what stage of immigrants, where you are, I would think that there could be ways that to tap into that in terms of one way to tap a global connection, where you're inviting people. Maybe you start with something from your collection that represents this, and having people from the community tell their stories or add on to what the connections are globally, or make connections with their relatives or friends in other countries. But again, it's starting from that object that maybe is in a US collection, in your house collection, but it actually has some relationship to other areas in the world through people in your community as well. And are there ways that you could tap that? Well, I think you see that like at a tenement museum too. Yeah.
I think for me, it's been one of the silver linings during this pandemic is that travel is not a limitation, right? And I find myself going to a lecture in the East Coast, and then I'm back in California for something different, and then I can go to Mexico for something else, and I can, I feel like collaborations and tapping into other colleagues that share your passion and want to experiment with you, and really kind of explore different ideas. This is like the time, because I feel like our focus is allowing us to do something like that. So I think understanding, bridging those things right now would be really exciting. Like having, kids from one country talk to another, group of kids from this country, and having it be about an object, or having it be about a story, or how we all tell this story differently, or whatever. And I think, again, it feels so, in some ways we're closer to each other because of the technology, because of the ability to just go anywhere. To me, it's mind blowing. Like I always have to pick, around Day of the Dead time, what to go to. And this year I was able to go to Oaxaca, Mexico, and see what they were doing there. Mexico City, which I've never been to during Day of the Dead. I was in Chicago, and then I was in Oakland. It's just like amazing. Like I got to go around the world almost, and never left my living room. But I don't know that I would have spent that much time trying to do that on a day that I was outside, in before COVID.
It occurs to me that like one idea might be, you remember there used to be these people used to have pen pals. I don't think that's people don't have that anymore. I'm sure you could, digital people could find a parallel to something digitally, but this notion of pen pals where you would communicate with someone far away that you've never met, but you would find something in common and communicate with them. And I think during this time, it would be cool if small museums, say a group, say one person in a small history museum decided that you really wanted to be in touch with other museums that had something similar to you. And again, bringing it back to collections. Maybe you have one thing in your collection or that seems iconic to the community or whatever. How many other museums in other small towns have something similar? I remember I was talking to a colleague who was working in Argentina, and he put together a consortium of museums that all had collections that focused on radio. And so they all got together and they emailed and they had digital meetings and stuff. And then they all started developing an exhibit together about radio. And then they started sharing with each other their radio paraphernalia and stuff. And then they decided they were going to put together a radio program about historic radio.
That's cool.
These were like 8 different museums.
That's cool.
All across South America who had never even talked to each other before. And then they got radio aficionados to like participate and be the volunteers. And it's, it's as broad as your mind will allow you to go. It's like you can be as creative as possible, and you reach out and you have a conversation with people, and all of a sudden they're part of your museum, and you never even really planned it that way.
Yeah.
And there's so many fun things you can do. You can do stuff around food. You can do stuff like, because I'm thinking all the cool cooking utensils, like different kitchens around the world have. How cool would it be to kind of see what those look like in different parts of the world? Or hearing lullabies from across the world in real time from different people, or what are your favorite childhood stories? I just feel like you could go so many places and have so much fun with it, because at the end of the day too, our work is fun, and I think why not have fun? Why not kind of have a moment of levity and provide that for our world and our communities where we're just enjoying humanity and enjoying each other.
Exactly.
Yeah, I found too. Yeah, exactly. And what are those bonds? Like you kind of cited some things that are universal, like the storytelling, but the food, the traditions. People care about family. There's a shared bond in terms of people want their parents want everyone wants their children to do well. How can I support them in their education? And the museums is part of that support. And I found too that communities are very interested, whether local or global, in what youth are thinking, what's on their minds, what do they care about, what's important to them. And we did a lot of youth projects, and we'd hear from adults that say, I was worried about youth, but God, I'm not at all anymore now, because it's giving them a platform, the youth a platform. And however you want to define youth, it can be what 15 to 25. I mean, it varies. But to bring in their perspectives, when an activity can be done online through a program. The National Civil Rights Museum, if you go to their website, they one of their partners is After School Alliance. You can go to that category, and you'll see they did a whole program around youth entrepreneurs. I can't say that word because there are too many syllables and I talk fast. So. But anyway, it was a fabulous program, and these youth are teaching them how to prototype, how to experiment. So there was about 8 youth who were sharing what they were doing, but it was part of this partnership with the National Civil Rights Museum. And so again, museums are small and large, but it's this history that's continuum through time and that human experience and how we do continue to thrive and survive and be resilient for that. And I think that bringing that youth perspective, and also often in conjunction with the elder, where they're learning from each other, is very powerful for people, for our communities, to bridge those perspectives too, as well.
And it seems that all of those ideas, bridging the perspectives from your global community or local community, also work when you have a really diverse local community. It's also a good way when you're in maybe a very urban environment where your community is very diverse, and it's a good way to find maybe a common thread or a way to bring your communities together
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was thinking, even if you were in a community that wasn't that diverse, you could partner with another museum and that was, I mean, and just bridge your communities that way too.
Yeah. One of the things I really believe about museums, I think, since I stumbled into them and started working in them many years ago, and I've worked for art and history and science, children's museums, and that museums are really about us. They're really about the human experience. And it doesn't matter if, it doesn't matter. In fact, I think today we need to kind of tear down some of the boundaries between types of museums like art and history, science and children's. The world isn't divided up into these disciplines the way we in museums think we've got to divide everything up into these little silos of discipline.
Yeah.
But to really reach out and maybe partner, if you partner with if you're a small history house, contact a museum that's about railroads, or contact other small museums out there that might not even be in your own state, and see if you can just spend a time, say, can we have a conversation about how we might be able to work together? And that sounds crazy, but you know how many people would say yes? And people are looking for those kinds of openings and opportunities. And I think comes back to that notion of like experimenting and being afraid to fail. It's kind of like invite some people over to dinner, and if they say no, don't take it personally. Maybe invite them later, after, invite somebody else. But there are people out there looking to make connections, and you could just say, we want to explore how we might be able to partner with another museum around engaging the community with collection objects, and go beyond your walls. Even if you're volunteers, there are volunteer groups where you could reach out and connect with another volunteer group from another state and really look at your differences and similarities. How many historic museums have old butter churns or those cast iron cooking pots that everybody, and how you might be able to kind of come up with disparate stories around similar objects, or look for human connection that brings human beings together to share, to celebrate what us as humans is about. And the objects are really the things that they're kind of the third thing that you can have really comfortable conversations. You put an object in front of you and you have three strangers, and you can still have a comfortable conversation because each person brings their experience about the object, and you're all looking at the same thing. And it takes away some of the discomfort of trying to establish a connection with someone, a total stranger. You're both, or all of you are focusing on this other thing, the third thing, that then allows you to have really interesting conversations that can lead somewhere, that could lead to a program or an exhibition.
Well, something you said, Kathy, like really struck me, and that's the this idea that if you get it, like if you invite somebody and they say no, it's like, don't take that like as a failure. I feel like there's the idea of cultivating communities and the way that we think about, for example, like we think about cultivating donors. This really kind of stuck with me once. I was talking to someone and in development, they were saying to cultivate a new donor, it takes something like 4 to 8 interactions, from introducing them to the museum to getting them to make a donation. And I'm like, well, why do we think that when we approach a community member, they're going to be like, yay, I want to work with you? And like, no, there's mistrust there. There's a sense of, why do you want me to be part of this? So I feel like this, if you're truly committed to bringing in others into your fold, there's got to be a commitment to a long game. It's not going to be one time. And it's like, you have to do it once, and then you have to show that like you could do it well, or that there's integrity to what you're doing, you're following through. And I think in the same way that we also try to maintain relationships with donors and other folks that bring other contribute in other ways to museums, we have to think about our community in the same way. If you invite them to be in an exhibition, what are the ways that you can keep them involved? Can they become members? Can they automatically get like a little written invite from you when you have an opening once a year? What are the ways that you maintain those relationships so that you are truly in community and maintaining that kind of back and forth?
And this is a kind of,
I'm gonna jump in and say we have 5 minutes left. So we've got time for each of you to have a final thought. If you want to continue with this, that's great. But we do have 5 minutes left. So Kathy, why don't you continue with what you were saying?
I just forgot what I was saying.
Or do you want to have
like, oh my God.
or do you want to start with some final thoughts and we'll go around?
I want to bring it back to collection objects, because I think we've been talking a lot about community in more philosophical ways and why we need to connect with communities and how. And I have a couple of little examples of things, little experiments that some of my clients have done over the years to just try out some things with collection objects. And one of them was a project that was funded by Pew Foundation, and it was a garden, a historic house and garden in Pennsylvania, Bertram Gardens. And they had, and this gets to another question of like your community changing over time. And they had, they were a very kind of small, kind of fancy little house and garden, and over time it became suburbs, or not even suburbs, but almost like inner city in Philadelphia, and they didn't know their community at all. And so their project was, their goal was, we want to get to know our community and we want to do something around collection objects. So what they did was they took from their own history, of their organizational history, and which was, you know, this garden, and they had in the past, they had propagated plants and traded them and sold them and distributed plants to people. So one of the guys from the museum got on his bike and had a cart in the back, and they took all these seedling plants and he just bicycled through the community. And he did this trade program where he asked community members to give him an object of one of their objects that they felt, you know, had of value to them for a particular reason, and wrote why this object was important to them, and they would trade. They would get a plant from the museum and they would have this object, and then at the end of this program they displayed all of the objects and the labels from the communities who had given them, the people who had given them the objects. And they made great new relationships, and I'm going too long, so I'm going to stop. But it's, you know, I think these are like examples of like how to get started, you know, how to actually do something concrete that will help people engage. Start small.
I love that. Evelyn, do you have a final thought for us?
I think it's as important to be in community as it is to go with the intention of serving community. I feel like that's been a really important guiding principle, and I feel like if I had to impart one thing, that could be it. And don't be afraid to experiment.
Perfect. And Barbara?
Yeah, I think it's that listening when you're going into the community and you're having the conversations, and it's listening to what's on people's minds. And do you see there's some way that the museum can help address that with community to bring their voices in? And I say that because I remember once being in an advisory council meeting and a member is saying, you know, I've been at the library, Latino Advisory Council, I've been to the library and museums. There's nothing about Latinos in the 20th century. It's like we didn't even exist. And I don't have time to go into the project, but out of the project, we created this what's called the Latino History Project, where we engaged youth in interviewing elders in 2 cities in the East Bay here. That generated exhibits. It generated collections for the museum to fill the gaps. It generated 3 publications. I'm just saying it generated so much, but it all came from this one comment. from advisory council member. She wasn't proposing a project, but she expressed a concern. So it's really that very mindfulness of listening and not giving up to see where there is an opening there. Well, we could help. We could help together address that.
Mhm.
It's a marathon. It's a beautiful marathon together.
Great. Yes. Exactly. So thank you all. Thanks again, Barbara, Kathy, and Evelyn, for sharing your experience and knowledge with us today. And thanks to all the attendees. I know we all spend a lot of time online these days, and I really appreciate you spending this hour with us today.
Thank you all.
We at CatalogIt are happy to share this webinar with you. We're committed to being a resource to our community and look forward to offering more programs in the future. I know that some of you left questions and comments in the chat in the chat box. We'll be getting back to you with answers soon. And we also, please feel free to send us any questions that you have. Again, my email is joy@catalogit.app, and I'm happy to forward them on to our panelists, and we'll get answers back to you. So thank you all again for joining us today, and thanks again, Barbara, Kathy, and Evelyn. I appreciate it so much.
Joy.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thank you. Bye.